it's time for the 27th film in my 31 Horrors of Mike. And this is a film which I've tried really to avoid, and the reason is that in some ways I feel it's really overrated, in other ways I feel it's very underrated. It's a film which I'm very conflicted about. It's also a film which many people have talked about to death, but I really feel that it's a film which I should address because of its importance to the horror genre. So the movie we're talking about is the 1999 film The Blair Witch Project. The film follows three documentary makers as they head off into the woods in search of the Blair Witch, a local legend or myth which is built up over many years and through many tragic events. While after speaking to some locals and investigating the myth, the documentary makers eventually find themselves lost in the woods, disorientated, unable to find their way back to civilization, and each night feel they are being visited by a malevolent force. So that's the story. The story? Don't know why I said that in such a strange voice. That's the story, and it's what's uncommon about it for the time is that the entire film is told through the footage that the documentary filmmakers record, and this has led to it being known as a found footage film. And in many ways, some people felt it was the successor to Cannibal Holocaust, which was the film which really started the trend into making documentary horror films. But it wasn't really until The Blair Witch was made that people started making these films en masse, and the reason for that is that The Blair Witch made a shitload of money, and it was made for almost nothing. It had such a small budget, but it recouped that so many times over that people, wanted a bite of that apple. So there were a bunch of different documentary films made, documentary horror films made, some of them good, most of them not. And we still see documentary horror films being made now. Some great films like Wreck, which owe a lot to Blair Witch, but are actually superior to it in my view, although it's a different type of film, I suppose. It's unfair to compare them in that way. So the thing with The Blair Witch is that when I came out of the cinema from watching it, I'd been really psyched. Myself and my two friends that I went with to watch it were huge horror fans, and we came out very disappointed. The film didn't really have much of an effect on us while we were watching it. We came out and we were sort of like, was that it? Was that what all the fuss was about? And then we all went home and we spoke to each other the next day, and we'd each individually had a rough night because the imagery from the film had actually stuck with us. Most specifically, the last image of the film, the ending to the film, which is really, the whole film is quite slow in a lot of ways, and then it builds up to this crescendo, to this sort of release of tension, and some very effective, very simple, chilling images which have been alluded to earlier in the film when the documentary filmmakers were talking to the locals. It's also an important film because it used the internet, and also they had made a documentary about the Blair Witch, which was shown on television, where people started to believe that this was real, this was the found footage. They used completely unknown actors, probably because they couldn't get anyone else anyway, but it was a smart move nonetheless, because people started thinking, these people were like listed online as missing and stuff like that. So people really believed this was real. Oh, this is the found footage. This is the footage that the police found, and they had originally filmed it as a more expansive documentary where you would have police interviews talking about these kids going in. It would cut between their investigation and the investigation of the documentary filmmakers themselves, but eventually they just cut all that out and used that as a television documentary to promote the film, and it really made people think that it was a real thing, that something terrible had happened to these young filmmakers in the woods. The problem with the film is probably that it was a victim of its own success. If we look at another film which was made for very little and broke all records, Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween, it's expertly made, so people went to see that. There was a lot of buzz about it, and there was no sort of letdown. However, with the Blair Witch Project, I think there is, just because it was so hyped, and I think that's a lesson to anybody. You know, even films that I'm really looking forward to, I try to go in with as low an expectation as possible for what the end product's going to be like, because I went in like psyched for this film. I really did. But it's a movie which I've watched a couple of times since, and I do think it's good. I think that the performances are good for the most part. I think you can tell there are little parts in the film where it becomes hammy, overacted, and I think that breaks the tension of the movie in some ways. I think if they had been able to keep the hysteria down a little bit. However, the performances on the whole are still very good, and it's a really simple tale as well. It is essentially a ghost story. Um, but there are real amateurish moments in the movie. But the whole thing that saves the film, like I say, is the conclusion. Not a lot happens throughout it. There are a few creepy moments, but really, the end of the movie, which relates back to something which was mentioned at the start of the film, is chilling. It's a really frightening image, and I think one of the other reasons that the Blair Witch is an important film is that it really again it was kind of like the Clerks of the horror genre. It really inspired a lot of people to pick up cameras and make films on nothing, on like shoestring budgets, using subpar equipment in a lot of ways, and I think that if you look at that time, I remember going to like video stores and there were just so many rip-offs of it. And then there were more sort of higher budgeted rip-offs of it as well later on. The sequel is awful. It's one of the worst films I've ever watched. The Book of Shadows, I don't know what they were thinking when they were making it. It's awful, and it killed that franchise dead, which is a real shame, because and I hope the Blair Witch is something that they go back to, because I think there is I think a more mature filmmaker can maybe come in and do something quite special with the mythos. There's a lot of stuff in there about, in some ways, sort of the ghosts of child killers and things like that, and there isn't really much more sinister than that out there. You know, I mean, that's about as to me as creepy an idea as you can have for what a supernatural sort of being could be. And but one of the things that the film does have, even though it does have a lot of problems, it does also really it really does show you that less is more sometimes. That not showing anything, because you don't really see anything at all, really, which some people won't like. But it kind of goes back to an earlier film I talked about, which is Cat People. Some people don't like the fact that you don't really see much in Cat People, sort of Val Lewton approach, but here it definitely works, and there is a genuine hysteria within the film, which I think you do feel when you're watching it. I don't know if when I first went to see it the problem was that maybe the atmosphere in the cinema wasn't good, but it's a film that something there are a few films that I've watched, and as times went on, the images sort of play on you, and you start to realise after a while that you liked it a lot more than when you first watched it. Even without a second viewing, you think about it a lot more. And vice versa, sometimes you go to see a film and you think you love it, Phantom Menace, anyone? And then you come out like 6 months later, you start realising, going, actually that wasn't very good. So anyway, that's the Blair Witch Project. It's absolutely worth a watch. I think there are some very good things in it. I think there are some poor things in it. It's a mixed bag, but it's an important film, and it has some genuinely creepy moments, and I think the conclusion to the movie is really chilling. One last note, a year previous there was a film called The Last Broadcast which was released, and the thing with The Last Broadcast is that there's this debate about which came first, and there seems to be a lot of, some people say the Blair Witch was actually made first, but The Last Broadcast was released first, and there seems to be the suggestion that maybe somebody stole an idea from someone. I don't know the truth behind that. What I can say is that I have watched the last broadcast. I watched it round about the time that the Blair Witch came out, and it's a documentary horror film as well, but it's set out as a documentary. The last broadcast is interesting, but it's not as effective as the Blair Witch, and also there's a narrative change which I've never seen anything like in my entire life. Watching something, it seemed ridiculous, where the film goes from being in from a documentary perspective to being in the sort of third person. Very strange, very weird, and the whole film fell apart to me because of that. But the last broadcast is still worth checking out, and you can make your own mind up about it if you think the Blair Witch Project borrows heavily from it. But anyway, so that's the Blair Witch Project. Go and check that out. You probably already have, because like I say, it's one of the most famous horror films ever made, and I'll be back soon with another horror review. Bye for now.